Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to my channel. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that's been bugging me for a while now. The decline of horror games. Now, don't get me wrong, I still love horror games. I have an entire channel dedicated to them, and I play them almost every day. And I've played through most of the classics. Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Outlast. All of these titles shaped my love for the genre. But in recent years, it feels like something's been lost. Horror games aren't hitting the same anymore, and I want to explore why. Before we jump into the discussion, I'd really appreciate your feedback on this video essay. It's not something I do often, so any tips or suggestions are more than welcome. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to leave a like, hit that subscribe button, and maybe even drop a comment down below to discuss the topic or just to say hi to the algorithm. With that said, let's get into it. Back in the day, horror was spearheaded by major studios with big budgets and grand visions. Resident Evil and Silent Hill were massive productions made by teams with serious resources. These games had the power to push boundaries, not just in scares, but also in world building, mechanics, and storytelling. But over time, things began to change. The horror genre started to feel formulaic, like it was rehashing the same ideas. Meanwhile, the rise of first-person shooters like Call of Duty and Halo pushed big companies toward mainstream action. Horror became secondary to flashy explosions and high-paced combat. A prime example is Resident Evil 6. This game almost abandoned the franchise's core survival horror mechanics, opting instead for bombastic set pieces and shootouts. Sure, it reached a broader audience, and in my opinion, it was a great game and a nice change of pace. But longtime fans, not so much. And that's when indie games stepped in. Suddenly, titles like Slender Man, Outlast, and Five Nights at Freddy's blew up. These games were smaller in scale, but they brought horror back to its roots: atmosphere, tension, and psychological terror. Slender Man, The 8 Pages, is a great example, because it created horror in a very simple but effective way. It threw you on a dark forest with nothing but a flashlight to your name, and with the objective of collecting 8 pages. After picking up the first page, a droning noise starts, and the Slender Man begins the chase for you. The more pages you pick up, the more likely he is to spawn, and the more aggressive he gets, and the louder the noises and ambient noises are, creating more and more tension as the game progresses and gets harder. This is just one example of how these games showed that indie developers could deliver raw, visceral horror even without huge budgets. But here's the catch. While indie horror is incredibly important, the genre can't thrive on indie developers alone. The biggest indie horror games, Five Nights at Freddy's and Outlast, were massive hits, but not all small studios have the resources to push horror to the next level. Indie games often have creative ideas but lack the technical polish or depth of gameplay that major studios can provide. And that's why I think horror needs a balance. A combination of indie creativity and big budget ambition to truly move forward. One of the biggest issues facing horror games today is the lack of engaging gameplay mechanics. When you think back to classic horror games, they weren't just about jump scares or spooky settings, they were interactive experiences. Take Resident Evil 4 for example. The game forces you into life or death scenarios where every bullet, every herb, and every move matters. You're not just running away, you're fighting for survival with strategic resource management, limited ammo, and real consequences for failure. Every decision you make feels like it has weight. Do you save your last few bullets for a tougher enemy ahead, or do you risk using them now and hope to find more later? In contrast, many modern horror games have stripped away that player agency. Instead of making tough choices or engaging in deep mechanics, you're often just walking through a haunted house, waiting for the next jump scare. These walking simulators emphasize atmosphere, but they often sacrifice gameplay. Layers of Fear and Visage, for example, offer strong environments and creepy vibes, but they lack the complexity of something like Silent Hill 2, where puzzles, resource management, and exploration made you feel like you were part of the world, not just a passive observer. Silent Hill 2 did something genius with its design. It didn't just give you puzzles for the sake of padding. Every puzzle tied into the game's themes and narrative. Solving them wasn't just about progressing, it was about piecing together the twisted psychology of the protagonist. It forced you to engage with the story in a deeper way, making the scares hit harder because you were emotionally and intellectually invested in what was happening. This is something I miss in modern horror, where most games just ask you to walk from point A to point B while something jumps out at you, even without having any weight or importance in the game's story or contributing to the storytelling. Which brings me to my next point. Let's talk about storytelling for a minute. I think it's about time we talk about the stories. A good story is crucial for horror because it creates emotional investment. You're not just scared by the creatures or the environment. You're scared because you care about the characters, the world, and what happens to them. Silent Hill didn't just scare you with monsters. It used its narrative to create psychological dread. You were also scared of what these monsters represented and what they meant to the protagonist. The town itself was an extension of the protagonist's guilt and trauma. Every creature, every location felt like a reflection of deeper emotional wounds, and that made the horror far more impactful. Compare that to many recent horror games, where the story is either too basic or barely exists. And sometimes the problem lies in the execution of this story's events and the way they're presented. Things like an excessive use of notes and audio tapes can make the player feel very disconnected from the narrative and gives the feeling of being told a story instead of playing it or living through it. Games like The Last of Us and Alan Wake show that even action-heavy games can have deep, well-presented and impactful storytelling that adds to the horror. The Last of Us, for example, uses characters' relationships and the brutal realities of its world to make every threat feel personal, presenting them at a slow and steady pace and defining them with events that unfold during the game's story, rather than giving you an exposition where you're told all their backstories. Knowing and caring about these characters creates a bond with these people that, coupled with the hostile environment and creatures presented here, makes you genuinely worried for their lives and adds an extra layer of horror to your experience. This, coupled with its brilliant use of its great soundtrack, create a story and present it in a way that's very hard to forget, even after finishing the game. And now for one thing that I can't help but complain about in modern horror games, and that is
Get them out!
jump scares. Talking about horror games, it's a necessary and obvious point that I have to mention. Now, I'm not saying that jump scares are inherently bad. When they're done right, they're super effective. But here's the problem. Too many horror games today rely on them as a crutch. They use jump scares as the main form of fear, rather than building atmosphere, tension, and dread. It's like they're serving up a quick shock. There's no lasting impact. What makes a jump scare work isn't the scare itself, but the build-up, the anticipation, the uncertainty, the slow increase in tension until that moment of release. That's what Amnesia, The Dark Descent, did so well. You know something was coming, but the game made you wait for it. It let your imagination run wild before finally showing the horror, and in some cases, it just didn't. Until it did. Games like Outlast and Slender also understood this balance, keeping you constantly on edge. You were terrified not because something jumped out at you every few minutes, but because you never knew when it would. That's what modern horror games are often missing. They skip the suspense and go straight for the cheap scare, which, being honest, ends up feeling hollow after the 10th time. Now, we can't talk about the decline of horror games without mentioning the rise of predatory tactics in the industry. It wouldn't be the first time we see things like these. Games have had microtransactions for a very long time, so it's only normal to expect that to come to the horror game industry as well. But not in the way that Poppy Playtime, for example, did it. Poppy Playtime was a game that, while interesting in concept, was quickly overshadowed by controversies involving NFTs and aggressive marketing towards children. This game became nothing but a ploy to generate the most money they can with the least effort. I know that technically that is the goal of all businesses. Generate the most money while spending the least resources. But in this case, it simply became predatory. It's frustrating because it cheapens the emotional connection we have to these games. Poppy Playtime is not a game with a very deep story, but it still is frustrating to see. We've seen this in other franchises too, where horror games turn into cash cows rather than immersive experiences. And when the focus shifts from creating genuinely terrifying moments to selling microtransactions or endless DLC packs, it's the players who suffer. Horror, at its core, should be about immersion. The second you pull players out of the experience to ask them to buy something, you break that immersion. Games like Dead by Daylight have balanced this better, offering microtransactions without sacrificing the core experience. But not every horror game pulls this off, and it's hurting the genre as a whole. So for a conclusion for this video, I want to talk about where this leaves us. The horror genre is at a crossroads. On one side we have indie developers who are keeping the spirit of horror alive with innovative ideas and creative storytelling. On the other, we have big studios that could take the genre to new heights, but often prioritize profits over genuine scares. What we need is a return to what made horror games great in the first place. Meaningful mechanics, strong storytelling, tension over cheap scares, and a real respect for the player's intelligence. There is still hope for future horror games. Games like Signalus, Tormented Souls, It Steals show that horror can still innovate while paying homage to its roots. And even big publishers are back on the game recently, with Resident Evil 8 Village, Resident Evil 4 Remake, if you can count that as a horror game, Silent Hill 2 Remake, Dead Space Remake, and some others. Most of them are remakes, which might mean that we haven't evolved past those games yet. We still rely on them to have a good structured horror experience. But as those small and creative indie studios evolve and gain more traction, we might get more interesting entries in the future with bigger budgets. But the genre needs to evolve, not just recycle old ideas or lean on easy tactics to make a quick buck. But hey, that's just my take. Let me know what you think in the comments. What horror games are still hitting the mark for you, and what you would want to see from the genre in the future. If you like this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.